What
The
about the
church,
church?
the bigger challenge with the church is that the church got co-opted into, I mean, it's part of the colonial modernity package. So, of course, it came with a lot of that baggage. They're basically trying to create an alternative government system, which, I mean, to be fair, the private sector has a 70-year head start in Kenya. And given that the private sector, its initial investment was, the colonial schooling system, the hospital system, the basic infrastructure that are supposed to be provided by the government. So when you have a country that is 130 years old, give or take, and the first 70 years of it was run as a private system where, the colonial enterprise, the colonial empire provided the public social services that are supposed to be provided by the government. By the time the government, or, the independence is declared, so to speak, in 1963, you basically have had an alternative government running for over 60, 70 years, and a lot of these governments let go.
But also the missionaries actually came before the private sector, and the missionaries, their job was to convert people for private capital. So for them, the evidence of conversion to Christianity was that now you're having a job and you're earning money from a settler. So for them, that was the epitome of being a Christian. So actually, the church prepared people for capital. So when now you have this celeb CEO turn from the 90s, then you also have pastors modeling the CEOs actually. So even in their clothes, they are talking. In fact, sometimes you can't even tell the difference between a pastor and a motivational speaker, because they're basically, they have the same profile, the same aura, the same clothes, the same talk. And in fact, they even started having conferences together, right?
There are two forces that feed into that. There's what happens with the emerging church movement in the 70s that basically begin to talk exactly like Peter Drucker, start saying, everything has to be measurable, including in church. I don't know how you're going to measure people's souls, but somehow they assume they could. And there are books around it, actually, and some of them are actually touted even here in Kenya. Basically, books that are built around telling people, church has to be run as something almost just close to a business. Everything has to be measurable and everything has to fit, within that model. They didn't realize that was a model even people within the business world were questioning. Now, how worse does it get when religion adopts that? So there's the colonial missionary setup, and then there's the colonial enterprise and the colonial state 130 years ago, the private sector, the colonial private sector, basically, and then the colonial missionary setting with the church. And of course, that's pretty much tentacles of the same bigger colonial global infrastructure. But then what we begin to see, especially in the last 30, 40 years, is basically the effect of what finance capital was doing with those CEOs and their big payout in the 70s and going into the 80s and going into the 90s. Is the church adopted a more or less similar approach also of saying everything has to be measurable. Remember, that is actually a phrase from Peter Drucker, what cannot be measured cannot be something,
Cannot, so, what cannot be counted does not count.
Yeah, so it becomes their thing in there. So it's the moment that gets into the church, of course, the church and business are not far off. And remember, there's already a pre-existing relationship between colonial missionary and colonial private enterprise.
Capital,
so it was a it was a modernization of that relationship. So you can take what say CMS and the colonial governor were doing in 1940, and you can draw parallels between what the church is doing in the 80s and the 90s with the private sector. It was basically a modernization of a very old relationship in a sort of a recalibration of that relationship into a more modern or modernized context. And so that is where the church becomes part of this thing. Basically, the church starts to, being co-opted, first of all, with the state, of course, but also mostly with the business side of things. And in many ways, the church comes out more corrupted than even the business sector. Because the business sector, I mean, they're already questioning it. I mean, there are people who are questioning this. And of course, even on the church side, there are people who are saying, no, this is not how to go about doing, work. This is not how to look at work. This is not how to talk about remuneration. This is not how to approach the question of even the theology of work, work as God's gift to us, work as something that is meaningful beyond,
beyond the money that it makes.
Yeah, and the shareholding, the purely financial capital end of things. Yeah. So
in fact,
what work means for our souls. Yeah.
Yeah. And for the sake of those who are watching, just to clarify, just to remind us that prosperity gospel is basically that language, the language of things are measured by value. So even prosperity gospel says that your faith is evident in the money that you make. And if you're not making money, it means that you don't have faith.